Welcome back to Quiet History by Song. Tonight, we are going to experience history from a different perspective. There will be no presidents making decisions in distant offices, no maps showing armies moving across continents, and no long discussion of diplomacy. Instead, imagine that you are an ordinary soldier on the Western Front during the First World War. It is early morning. The sky above northern France is pale and gray. Your boots are damp. Your uniform feels heavy. Somewhere nearby, a kettle is being heated for tea. Around you stretches a narrow world of earth, timber, sandbags, wooden boards, and mud. You have slept only a few hours. Soon, another ordinary day in the trenches will begin. For millions of soldiers who served on the Western Front between 1914 and 1918, war was not a continuous series of dramatic battles. Much of their time was spent waiting, watching, repairing, eating, writing letters, trying to sleep, and attempting to remain reasonably warm, dry, and comfortable in an environment that made all three surprisingly difficult. Tonight, rather than concentrating on combat, we will quietly explore this everyday world. What did soldiers eat? Where did they sleep? How did they keep clean? What did they do when nothing was happening? And perhaps, most importantly, what did an ordinary day in the First World War trench actually feel like? Find a comfortable place to rest. Let the room around you become quiet. And let us travel back more than a century to the trenches of the Western Front. When the First World War began in the summer of 1914, few expected the Western Front to become dominated by trenches. European armies initially moved quickly, but modern artillery, rifles, and machine guns made movement across open ground increasingly dangerous. Soldiers began digging into the earth for protection. What started as relatively simple defensive positions gradually developed into enormous and complicated trench systems. On parts of the Western Front, networks of trenches extended through France and Belgium for hundreds of miles. They were not simply two long ditches facing one another. There could be several defensive lines. The front line trench stood closest to the enemy. Behind it were support and reserve positions. Communication trenches connected these areas and allowed soldiers food, ammunition, messages, and equipment to move between them. A soldier entering the system could therefore walk considerable distances without ever stepping onto open ground. The walls might be reinforced with timber, corrugated iron, woven branches, or sandbags. Wooden boards, known as duckboards, were sometimes placed along the floor to keep men's feet above water and mud. Small shelters or dugouts were built into or behind the trench walls. Their quality varied enormously. Some were little more than shallow holes. Others, particularly in more established positions, could provide considerably better protection. But even an elaborate trench remained a temporary home made from earth, and earth behaved differently depending upon the weather. Imperial war museums. Rain could transform trench life. Water collected in low places. The ground softened. Boots sank. Uniforms became damp. Equipment became dirty. Men who had imagined war as marching along roads instead found themselves spending hours surrounded by mud. Conditions varied greatly according to location and season. Some trenches were relatively dry, others became badly waterlogged. On parts of the Western Front, particularly after heavy rain and bombardment had broken up the landscape, the earth could turn into a deep, sticky mixture that made ordinary movement exhausting. A soldier might carefully place one boot ahead of the other, trying not to slip from a wooden duckboard. Everything had to be carried through these conditions: food, water, ammunition, mail, tools, building materials, and sometimes wounded men. Then came winter. Cold weather brought another set of problems. Wet clothing became painfully cold. Frozen ground made repairs difficult. Snow and frost could cover a landscape that had already been torn apart. Accounts from Australian troops on the Western Front described the winter of 1916 to 17 as particularly severe, with waterlogged ground followed by prolonged frost and snow. And all the while, a soldier had to look after his feet. One of the dangers of prolonged exposure to wet and cold conditions became known as trench foot. A soldier standing for long periods in damp boots could develop swollen and painful feet. Severe cases could become extremely serious. The problem became common enough that armies developed routines intended to prevent it. Feet had to be inspected. Wet socks needed changing when possible. Men were encouraged to keep their feet dry and maintain circulation. It sounds like a small detail compared with the enormous events of the First World War, but to an individual soldier, a pair of dry socks could matter enormously. War on a map is measured in miles. War in everyday life can sometimes be measured in something as simple as whether your feet are warm and dry. A day in the front line often began before sunrise. Dawn and dusk were considered dangerous times because poor light could provide cover for an enemy attack. Soldiers therefore prepared themselves around these periods. Once the morning tension eased, ordinary routines returned. Weapons needed cleaning. Equipment needed checking. Damaged sections of trench required repair. Sandbags had to be filled. Water might need removing. Men could be assigned sentry duty. Others carried supplies. And then there was breakfast. For British soldiers, tea became one of the familiar comforts of trench life. Producing a genuinely good cup was not always easy. Water had to reach the front. Fuel might be limited. Containers could give water an unpleasant taste. Hot food could also arrive cold by the time it reached men in forward positions. Nevertheless, meals divided the day into familiar moments. They gave soldiers something ordinary to think about. A tin opened, bread divided, tea prepared. For a few minutes, attention could shift away from the war. Food varied according to army, location, supply conditions, and the stage of the war. For British troops, preserved food was especially important. One familiar ration was canned corned beef, commonly known as bully beef. Bread and hard military biscuits were also common. Beans, cheese, jam, and other preserved foods might appear. The famous army biscuit could be extremely hard and was sometimes softened or broken into other food before eating. Another remembered ration was mikonoshi, a canned meat and vegetable stew. It could be much more welcome when heated than when eaten cold. Getting hot meals all the way to front-line positions was difficult. Imperial War Museums notes that hot food was not routinely supplied to British front-line soldiers until later in the war, and even then, kitchens could not always reach everyone with a warm meal. Food was not simply nutrition. It was conversation. It was routine. It was something to complain about. And sometimes it was something to trade. Cigarettes were also issued to soldiers and could be exchanged for other items by men who did not smoke. Small comforts acquired enormous value when ordinary comforts were far away. Perhaps one of the most surprising things about trench warfare is how much of it involved boredom. Popular images of the First World War often show constant explosions and attacks. Those moments certainly occurred, but soldiers could also spend long stretches doing very little. A man might sit in the same section of trench for hours. He might clean his rifle again, repair equipment, smoke, talk quietly with the soldier beside him, write a letter, sleep when permitted, or simply wait. Veterans interviewed by Imperial War Museums remembered ordinary trench days as frequently monotonous, broken by sentry duty and practical jobs such as strengthening the trench with sandbags. The strange combination of boredom and uncertainty became one of the defining features of life at the front. Nothing might happen for hours. Yet everyone knew that conditions could change without warning. Perhaps that made the quiet moments feel even stranger. Among the most valuable objects arriving at the front were letters. There were no video calls, no instant messages, no photographs arriving seconds after they were taken. Communication with home depended largely upon paper. A soldier might sit against an earthen wall with a pencil and write to his parents, his wife, his children, a brother, a sister, a friend. He might describe the weather, ask about the family, mention food, make jokes, and sometimes deliberately avoid describing the most frightening parts of his experience. Letters traveled in the opposite direction as well. News from home could temporarily reconnect a soldier with ordinary life. Perhaps the family garden was growing well. Perhaps a younger sibling had started school. Perhaps someone had married. Perhaps a parcel contained food, cigarettes, socks, or another small comfort. Imperial War Museum's collections emphasize how important letters were for maintaining contact between servicemen and loved ones during the war. For a few minutes, the trench could disappear. The soldier was mentally somewhere else, at a kitchen table, beside a familiar fireplace, walking along a street he knew. Then the letter was folded, placed carefully into a pocket, and the trench returned. The soldiers were not alone. Rats became a notorious feature of trench life. Food scraps and waste attracted them. The conditions of the battlefield provided further opportunities for large populations to thrive. Veterans later recalled rats stealing food and moving through trenches while men attempted to sleep. Keeping rations protected became important. Lice were another persistent problem. They lived in clothing and caused constant irritation. Soldiers attempted to remove them in whatever ways they could. The problem was not merely uncomfortable. Body lice could transmit trench fever, an illness that affected large numbers of troops. Keeping clean under such conditions was extremely difficult. Water was valuable. Bathing facilities were often far from the front. Uniforms might be worn for long periods. A modern person preparing for bed might consider a shower and clean clothing completely ordinary. For a soldier who has spent days in a forward trench, those simple things could feel luxurious. Eventually, every soldier needed rest, but sleeping in a trench was rarely simple. Depending upon the position, some men had access to dugouts. Others rested wherever they could find space. A fire step, the raised platform used by soldiers to observe over the parapet, could sometimes become a makeshift place to sit and sleep. A coat might provide a little protection from the cold. A dry sandbag could become a seat. Sleep was frequently interrupted. There were duties, noise, movement, cold, discomfort, and the simple difficulty of trying to rest while knowing that you were still at war. One British veteran recalled sleeping while sitting on the fire step, huddled beneath an overcoat, and described the resulting rest as very broken. Yet exhaustion has a way of overcoming discomfort. Men slept, they woke, and the routine continued. It is also important to remember that soldiers did not necessarily remain in the foremost trench continuously. Units rotated between positions. Depending upon circumstances, soldiers could spend time in the front line trenches, support positions, reserve areas, and billets farther behind the line. Life behind the front could be considerably more comfortable. There might be opportunities to wash, change clothing, eat better food, visit a canteen, write letters in greater comfort, talk with friends without constantly watching the parapet. Some troops found shops or local establishments when circumstances allowed. Australian accounts from early 1916, for example, describe billets relatively close behind the Western Front and access to army canteens and local establishments, though conditions could change dramatically with season and location. Soldiers also found ways to entertain themselves: cards, games, music, sports, gambling, performances. Anything capable of breaking the monotony could become valuable. The National WI Museum notes that troops across different armies use sports, cards, music, food, drink, and organized entertainment to escape the long periods of boredom. For a little while, men could behave less like soldiers and more like the young people many of them actually were. As daylight faded, the trench changed again. Dusk meant renewed alertness. Sentries watched carefully. Work that was dangerous during daylight could sometimes be performed after dark. Supplies moved forward. Repair parties worked. Men carried equipment through communication trenches. Night could provide concealment, but darkness also created uncertainty. Shapes became difficult to identify. Sounds seemed closer. A distant movement could attract attention. And after the day's routine, another cycle began. Watch, work, eat, wait, sleep when possible. Then dawn returned. For soldiers serving on the Western Front, this pattern could repeat again and again. The great events we remember from history books, the Somme, Ypres, Verdun, Passchendaele, were surrounded by thousands upon thousands of these ordinary hours. Hours of wet socks, cold tea, letters, cigarettes, mud, repairs, conversations, and waiting. When we think about the First World War today, we naturally remember its enormous battles. But for the individual soldier, history was often much smaller. It was the weight of a wet coat, the taste of a simple meal, the arrival of a letter from home, the relief of removing muddy boots, the irritation of lice, the sound of a friend talking quietly nearby, and the search for a few hours of sleep. Trenches were built because modern weapons made open ground extraordinarily dangerous, and over time, they developed into complicated defensive systems stretching across much of the Western Front. But inside those military structures lived ordinary human beings, attempting to create routines in extraordinary circumstances. Perhaps that is one reason their experiences remain so powerful more than a century later. History is not only the story of governments, generals, and battles, it is also the story of people trying to eat, trying to sleep, riding home, and waiting for another morning. Thank you for joining me on another quiet journey through history. Until next time, rest well, sleep peacefully, and thank you for listening to Quiet History by Song.